Hello, and thank you for tuning in to this week's Memo's Week Review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and our regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Hi, Mouin. How you doing? Good to see you again.
Hi, Nasim. Very good to see you, and always a pleasure to be on your program.
We've got a lot on today. We'll begin with a new report in the Lancet, shocking prediction that Gaza's death toll could reach as high as 186,000, which is 8% of the population of Gaza. We'll begin with that, then move on to a discussion about Israeli soldiers shooting Palestinians to relieve boredom, amongst other things, and then asking if Israel is sabotaging US-backed ceasefire proposal with new demands, and then move on to this really shocking revelation in the, well, it's not shocking if you've been followed it, but the Harrods is the latest newspaper to concede that Israel deployed the Hannibal directive, killing its own civilians. So we'll dissect that report as well, and then move on to some broader themes like the occupation of the West Bank, the largest land seizure in the occupied West Bank, and then the Arab League recognizing Hezbollah, well, actually not recognizing, but removing Hezbollah from its list of terrorist organization. What's the issue here? Why has the Arab League done that now? And then we'll end with a discussion about the elections here in the UK and also in France, and looking forward to the US elections as well, whether some of the themes that we've seen in the UK elections and the French elections will play out in the US. So there's a lot to get through, Moin, but let's start with, as I said, the Lancet report, counting the dead in Gaza. It makes a shocking prediction that the number of Palestinians killed directly and indirectly could reach as high as 186,000. That's nearly 8% of the population of Palestinians in Gaza. What are the main points highlighted by the Lancet, and what's the significance of this?
Well, this concerns a letter rather than a peer-reviewed article, as I understand it, submitted to the Lancet. But its findings, I think, were sufficiently compelling that the Lancet's editors, and they edit arguably the world's leading and best known medical journal, decided to publish it. And this letter basically seeks to determine the total number of deaths by looking at both direct, let's say, deaths as a result of the violence of war, and indirect deaths that can be attributable to the armed conflict. It's worth noting that in 2014, after Israel's Operation Protective Edge against the Gaza Strip, a similar study was conducted and found that the overwhelming majority of Palestinian casualties in that Israeli onslaught on the Gaza Strip were directly related to Israeli military violence against the Palestinians, and there were comparatively few indirect casualties. In this case, the suggestion is that the reality is completely different for a number of factors. The destruction, the systematic destruction of the Palestinian health system and health infrastructure, the deliberate withholding of essential goods such as food, water, medication, fuel, and so on, the rapid spread of communicable diseases amongst the population, the horrific situation of sanitation in the Gaza Strip, which under the current circumstances is only getting worse, and a number of other factors. And on this basis, what this letter concludes is that the number of indirect deaths that are attributable to Israel's military onslaught on the Gaza Strip constitute a much higher proportion of total deaths than those directly attributable to armed conflict, bombing, shootings, and so on. And on this basis, reach a figure of 186,000. It's, of course, an estimate rather than a precise calculation, but in my view, a very credible one. These people have obviously done their homework. Again, the Lancet doesn't publish just any letter it receives, but sifts through them carefully. And I think, it adds a lot to what are already plausible accusations of genocide against Israel by South Africa, now also by a number of other states, before the International Court of Justice, because it demonstrates, I think, that Israel is deliberately creating the conditions for mass death, not only by directly bombing and shooting at people in order to kill them, but also in terms of creating an environment in the Gaza Strip that is increasingly unsustainable for the preservation of life.
It's also worth, I think, pointing out that the Lancet report makes a point of saying that the death toll is accepted by the Israeli army, although it's been contested by the Israeli government and Western media outlets and Western governments as well, making the point of saying that this is Hamas is figures. But the Israeli army accepts that, the UN accepts it, all the major international organizations accept the death toll. So I think that's worth mentioning, and it's
Yes.
important to state that.
Yes, and if I can just add, I mean, this reflects a division between, for the sake of argument, let's call them professionals and propagandists, people who need to know the death toll, whether it is the UN or Israeli intelligence or the U.S. Intelligence agencies, have consistently found the figures emanating from the Ministry of Health in the Gaza Strip to be credible, not only since October 7th, but over the course of the past 2 decades. Propagandists, on the other hand, whose primary motivation is to delegitimize the Palestinian people, to pretend they don't exist, and now to pretend that they're not dying, try to concoct all kinds of pretexts to sow doubt and confusion about these figures. If it was up to them, they would have us believe that no civilians have been killed. They keep referring to the Hamas-run health ministry. Well, that has about as much credibility as referring to any figure emerging about the COVID pandemic in the United States as the Trump-run Department of Health and Human Services, or the Tory or Labor-run NHS. It's a meaningless attack on the professionalism, dedication, and commitment of the health sector in the Gaza Strip.
Hmm. And I think one of the reasons why the death toll is as high as it is we will get to in the second story, is the manner in which Israel is conducting the war. So if you recall, I think in March, Al Jazeera released footage of Palestinians being executed as they were by drones as they were walking beside a beach. And now it turns out that this is not some isolated incident. An Israeli magazine, Plus 972, has published a really comprehensive article based on the testimonies of 6 Israeli soldiers, showing that there was a directive from high up to fire on Palestinians at will, including civilians. And some of the testimonies are quite shocking. For example, Israeli soldiers elevating their own boredom by shooting at Palestinians. One soldier said that they enjoyed total freedom of action in shooting young girls and women. So these are quotes from the article itself. So 2 questions for you based on the Plus 972 magazine. Is first, what will the ICC and ICJ do with these new revelations in conducting its own investigation? And isn't this the obvious explanation for why there is such a high death toll, now reaching 40,000, and according to the Lancet, it could reach as high as 186,000.
Well, let me start by paying tribute to Plus 972 magazine, to its editorial leadership and its very diligent reporters and staff. This is not the first major story that they have revealed during the past year, despite stifling conditions of military censorship. And in fact, they've been doing this for many years. So I think paying tribute to their work is entirely appropriate as a prelude to responding to your question. And my main response would be that none of this should come as a surprise to anyone who is even remotely familiar with how the Israeli military has been operating essentially since it was established in the late 1940s. Of course, Israel's apologists and flunkies and then its government spokesperson and so on like to present this image of a highly disciplined army, of one that scrupulously receives and follows orders. You know, the whole story about the most moral army in the world and the purity of arms and all the rest of it. Yes, if you believe in fantasy, that's all true. In the real world, they don't follow orders in many cases because there are no orders. And when there are no orders, you're basically telling soldiers and commanders to do as they please with no restrictions. And most importantly, that they can do as they please with impunity because there will be no accountability. And this has been the consistent story, of course, over the past 8 months. And I think this story demonstrates once again that Israel considers Palestinian life to be not only worthless and expendable, but in fact a strategic target. And you can imagine that in a situation where Israel's military campaign against Hamas has been one of total and utter failure, that soldiers, commanders, senior officers would be, very much motivated to take out their frustrations and anger and rage at their consistent failures upon a much easier target, which is the civilian population of the Gaza Strip. But I do think there's another aspect of this worth highlighting as well. We can talk all we want about Israeli war crimes and these kinds of situations where, as the article reveals, there are no open fire regulations. In other words, soldiers can do as they please. But I think it's equally important to point out the reason that this is happening is because Israel's sponsors and allies in the West have essentially decided, on the one hand, to look the other way and to do no more than issue periodic anodyne statements about the need to respect international law, and at the same time, ceaselessly providing it with the weapons of mass murder that the Israeli military needs to conduct this genocide.
Yes, it is quite shocking, some of the images that's in the report by Plus 972. Dead, what they describe as dead zones being full of strewn bodies,
Yes.
decomposed bodies, and Israel clearing those decomposed bodies. If someone from an international organization comes to investigate or look to see the civilian deaths and casualties. So it's quite a shocking article, and I encourage all our viewers to have a look at that article. And talking about following directives, I think there's a clear example of Israel actually doing just that in the next story, which is a report in the Harrods, which to me seems like a smoking gun, exposing, well, the fact that Israel did issue the Hannibal directive, which you can speak about in a minute. But the article basically outlines that Israel on 7 October documents have been found by Harrods confirming that Israeli commanders repeatedly ordered their forces to stop Israelis being taken into Gaza at all cost, meaning they ordered their soldiers to fire at Palestinians in carrying out the attack, even though they may have Israeli hostages. So is this the smoking gun we've all been waiting for? And what does this revelation do in undermining Israel's narrative?
Well, Hannibal doctrine is part of Israeli military doctrine, which holds that a dead Israeli soldier is better than a captive Israeli soldier who can be used to negotiate a prisoner exchange. Regarding October 7th, we have already had confirmed examples of Israeli forces firing on vehicles, on homes inside Israel, in the knowledge that in doing so, they would be killing Israeli citizens as well. So in that sense, this is not an entirely new revelation. What I think is, and I should add that, of course, anyone who suggested that the Israeli army was in any way targeting its own people on October 7th in order to prevent their captivity in the Gaza Strip, and therefore bore at least partial responsibility for the numbers of casualties on October 7th, was immediately denounced and delegitimized as an anti-Semite and a Nazi and all the rest of that familiar stuff. I think what this article demonstrates is that on October 7th, there were clear and repeated orders by Israeli commanding officers to prevent the entry of any vehicle from Israel into the Gaza Strip, pursuant to the Hannibal doctrine. In other words, they knew that they were killing not just or targeting not just Palestinian militants who were returning to their bases in the Gaza Strip, but did so in the full knowledge and indeed in the expectation and with the objective that they were also killing any Israelis, not just soldiers, but also civilians who were being taken by Palestinian militants into the Gaza Strip as captives and hostages. So these attacks were of a systematic nature and raised the question, indeed, of how many, what proportion of Israeli casualties on October 7th should be ascribed to the Israeli military and its willful decision to target Israelis on that day, as opposed to being deliberately killed by Hamas and other Palestinians. We, of course, know that there is clear-cut evidence of Palestinian attacks on Israeli civilians and of atrocities on October 7th. But, you know, this is one more example, along with the beheaded babies, the babies roasted in ovens. This is just one more example that raises yet more fundamental questions about the Israeli narrative about what happened on October 7th. And it's important because it's the Israeli narrative that has dominated mainstream media coverage of that event. And you know, perhaps it's time that we start considering the Israeli version of events as propaganda unless and until proven otherwise, rather than taking it as gospel truth until almost a year later what we always suspected comes into the public domain. I should add that others, you know, such as Electronic Intifada and other researchers and analysts have looked into this and have repeatedly found evidence of Israel either killing or deliberately killing its own. This takes it to a whole new level and is worthy, I think, of further analysis and investigation.
Yes, and I think it is important to counter the Israeli narrative on this because every week I think we cover a story debunking accounts of 7 October. Last week we looked at the pile of evidence debunking the father and son rape hoax, and this week, of course, is the Hannibal directive. So and the amount of criticism those who had a different narrative got from the mainstream at the time. I think there's an apology due to people like, as you mentioned, Electronic Intifada and the Grey Zone and many others who have exposed the lie or some of the lies from 7 October.
Well, yeah, but don't hold your breath. I mean, if Netanyahu were to come out tomorrow and say he has evidence that Hamas recruited Martians to extract materials from the very center of the earth and use this to hypnotize Israeli women to engage in mass rape, you would see it all over the front pages of the New York Times and CNN and all the rest of them, repeated as a stunning revelation with zero skepticism. So I really wouldn't hold my breath for any accountability regarding these stories. I mean, let's go back to 2003 and the invasion of Iraq and the role that the mainstream media played and promoting all these deliberate falsehoods. There was never any accountability. Years later, one person lost their jobs and a small apology was made. Well, a million dead Iraqis later, that really doesn't qualify as accountability in any way, shape, or form.
Let's move on to our next story, which is talks between Hamas and Israel. Every week there seems to be one step forward, 10 steps back. And last week, again, it seems to be the same case where Israel was accused of attempting to sabotage the US-backed ceasefire deal. Because Israel is making new demands, apparently. So what are these new demands that Israel has put on the table?
Well, I think the broader story here has to do with growing divisions within Israeli elites about the objectives of this war. I think there's one section that has come to the conclusion that Israel is not going to achieve more than it has, that Israel is facing other challenges in the region, and that continuing its genocidal onslaught on the Gaza Strip, its military campaign in the Gaza Strip, on the one hand, exacerbates those threats, and on the other hand, makes Israel look continually weaker. Because let's not forget, I mean, the Gaza Strip is only marginally larger than the Caribbean island of Grenada, which, as some of your viewers may remember, the United States invaded in 1983, and I think it took them 36 hours or so to conquer the entire island. And it had a regular army and a Cuban military contingent as well. The Gaza Strip, now for 9 months, Israel has not been able to achieve anything of military significance. And I think there's a growing element within the Israeli elites that think that continuing failure reflects poorly on Israel, and in a sense, they should stop the bleeding, cut their losses, declare victory, and go home. There's another section that either wants this war to continue as a matter of principle because they're not looking at it in military terms, but looking at it through the prism of a genocide, which they hope to continue until there is nothing left. Or they believe, one last push, a final offensive, and Israel will finally be able to achieve its goals. So, look, for example, the Hamas leadership. Israel, on the one hand, claims it knows where they are. First they were under the Shifa hospital, then they were in Khan Yunis, then they were in Rafah. Now they're who knows where they've last been located. So we're to believe that Israel has at all times known exactly where these people are, but hasn't been able to locate and capture or kill them. It belies it's too much for words. But getting back to your question finally, so this ceasefire proposal is, according to the U.S. president, an Israeli proposal. And it appears that Hamas has responded to this proposal in its latest iteration by accepting that there will be no explicit Israeli statement regarding a permanent cessation of hostilities at the very outset of the implementation of this three-stage ceasefire proposal, but that they would instead accept guarantees from the mediators that once this agreement goes into effect, that it will, for all intents and purposes, result in a permanent ceasefire. Apparently, this was not a concession that Netanyahu was expecting the Palestinians would make, and it's not one he's prepared to accept because that would mean this deal actually comes to fruition. So he's thrown up a whole number of new conditions, um, objections to his own proposal, if you will, that Israel needs guarantees that it will resume the war until all objectives are met, that they will not allow what they describe as the return of thousands of armed Palestinians to the northern Gaza Strip, which is shorthand for saying they won't allow Palestinians to return to their homes, and several other conditions, which even according to Israeli negotiators and the mediators and others are statements designed to deliberately sabotage these negotiations and prevent an agreement from being reached and implemented. So, the real story here is trying to pin Israel down on an agreement that Israel itself has formulated. It's like trying to nail jelly to a wall, because there's a basic refusal to accept failure, to accept defeat, and to put an end to this war.
I think your image of Israel behaving like a headless chicken, running around like a headless chicken, is borne out by our next story as well, which is the idea of a Hamas-free enclaves or bubbles in a post-war Gaza. So this is an experimental model, part of a three-tier plan championed by the Israeli security establishment and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. The idea is to create small enclaves and bubbles, which is free of Hamas. A lot of commentators and also experts have mocked the idea, saying it's unworkable, it's not possible to have such enclaves, and this scenario of a post-war Gaza is nearly impossible. So is this plan dead before it's even got off the ground?
Yes, I mean, if you want enclaves free of Hamas, you first have to eradicate Hamas. And if you fail to eradicate Hamas, you can't have enclaves free of Hamas. It's a very simple equation. I think Israel's model for the Gaza Strip, and we've discussed this before, at least for those who do believe that Israel should formulate a plan for the next phase, as opposed to those who are committed to indefinitely continuing the current chaos and anarchy, is it's modeled very much on what Israel did in the West Bank in the aftermath of Operation Defensive Shield in 2002, when it basically invaded all the Palestinian cities that had previously been under the exclusive jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority, broke the back of the Palestinian Authority, broke the back of the resistance factions, and then spent subsequent years, let's say, from its perspective, mopping up the remnants. Well, not only did it not work ultimately in the West Bank, and it did, by the way, I should add, include a very high level of fragmentation, geographical fragmentation, and compartmentalization. So I think that model is also now being proposed for the West Bank. But not only did it not work ultimately in the West Bank, but it will be much, much more difficult to implement in the Gaza Strip, given the conditions that exist there. And I think Israel believes that if it creates these sterile bubbles where people can actually get food and water and medicine, that that will promote the success of this initiative. But again, you can't have territories free of a certain actor unless you first eliminate that actor. And if you don't have the capacity to eliminate that actor, you're not going to be able to create enclaves. Look back at the Strategic Hamlets campaign by the United States in Vietnam in the 1960s and 1970s. That fell flat on its face as well, because the precondition, which is the elimination and defeat of a military adversary, hasn't been met.
And I think there's a similar scenario in the West Bank as well, where Israel is running out of ideas on how to deal with the 2.3 million Palestinians that are there. Last week, there was the largest land grab in decades. I want to get your thoughts specifically on comments related to that made by a Jewish group, Peace Now. And they described the land grab as part of a strategy to establish buffer zone between Jordan and Palestinian land and choke off the possibility of a Palestinian state. The aim, says Peace Now, is to establish or is to push Palestinians into isolated islands, similar to bubbles, I guess you can say, surrounded by Israeli land. Is that the aim, do you think? It seems to be something very similar to what's been planned in the Gaza Strip.
Well, yes, I think what's happening now in the West Bank has several objectives. First of all, we have to recall, you and I and the civilized people and people with any knowledge of geography refer to this as the West Bank, refer to this as occupied territories. But of course, to Israel, its apologists and its flunkies, it's not the West Bank, it's Judea and Samaria. And it's not occupied territory, it's territory they insist they liberated when they invaded and occupied it in 1967. So they consider that in fact there is an illegitimate presence in the West Bank, but that illegitimate presence is not Israel. It's the Palestinians who have been living there for centuries, if not millennia. And the aim is, the maximum amount of land with the minimum amount of Arabs. Well, one way to do this is to seize the Jordan Valley and to ethnically cleanse it, a campaign that Israel has in fact been engaged in for many years, but which has accelerated markedly in the past several years, not only under the Netanyahu, Smotrich, Ben Gvir government, but its predecessors as well. And the Jordan Valley is not only vital because without it, there is no territorial contiguity between the West Bank and Jordan. And so the entire West Bank will be surrounded by Israeli territory, but it is also vital economically because it essentially functions as a natural hothouse and would be absolutely vital to any future for Palestinian agriculture, both in terms of the Palestinians' ability to feed themselves and in terms of generating exports and revenues from that. And so it's quite clear what Israel is seeking to do here: grab the land, get rid of the people.
I want to turn our attention to a story related to the ICC prosecutor Karim Khan. I want to first ask you whether you think, given the situation in the West Bank, Khan may expand his investigation. His investigation, of course, initially was limited to the Gaza Strip, but given what's happening in the West Bank now, there's clear ethnic cleansing, and the ICC was investigating war crimes, crimes against humanity in the West Bank. So could he be looking into expanding his initial investigation, where he's seeking arrest warrants for Netanyahu and others? And also comment on the fact that, there's reports now that Karim Khan was meant to travel to the Gaza Strip. There was an agreement with the US and the Brits to investigate the situation in the Gaza Strip before issuing arrest warrant, but he didn't do that, and that angered the Brits and the Americans. Cameron, who was the previous Foreign Secretary, he threatened Khan in a phone call, saying that Britain would pull out of the court and cut financial support. So, what should we read into the fact that Khan cancelled the plan and agreed visit to issue before issuing arrest warrants? And also, do you think, given what's happening in the West Bank, Khan would do what his predecessor did, which was to include war crimes and crimes against humanity in the West Bank within the remit of his investigation?
Well, Khan wouldn't need to expand his investigation because if we take him at his word, and I'm not necessarily saying we should, he already has an ongoing investigation into the situation in Palestine, which goes back to war crimes, crimes against humanity committed throughout the occupied territories since June of 2014. So he wouldn't need to start a separate investigation to address these issues. And in fact, when he issued his applications for arrest warrants earlier this year, many observers were in fact surprised that he limited himself to crimes relating to the Gaza Strip since October 7th, while essentially ignoring everything of the previous decade or so that he claims he has been intensively investigating since he came into office. Now, regarding this story about Khan canceling a trip to Israel and the Gaza Strip, reneging on an agreement to go there, and then instead issuing these applications for arrest warrants, leading to outrage in Washington and London. These stories emerge in the Israeli media, and I have to say there's something about them that doesn't quite add up, because Khan is known to be very, very close, not only to the government in London, which ultimately nominated him and campaigned for him. Khan is a British citizen, but also very close to Washington, which, despite not being a member of the ICC, championed his candidacy and actively lobbied for it. So the idea that Khan had an agreement to visit Israel and the Gaza Strip, and that this had been arranged for him by the Americans and the British, and that he then pulled out of this agreement and sought to apply for arrest warrants against Israel's prime minister and defense minister instead. There's something off about it. There's something about it that simply doesn't make sense. I suspect that what may have happened, and again, I'm purely speculating because although I'm skeptical about the existing reporting, I don't have confirmation of what actually did happen. But my suspicion is that it became clear to Khan that he was basically going for a photo opportunity, that he would ultimately either be denied entry to the Gaza Strip, or be allowed to do no more than a guided tour with Daniel Hagari of the Israeli military, who would, try to show him whatever. And basically, he, perhaps under pressure from his staff, concluded that this was a sham and that they had to revert to the conclusion of the process they were already working on. I just don't find that story convincing.
Yeah, and it could also be that there's so much evidence that's been accumulated. What does a photo op in Gaza
Yes.
do? So it doesn't really make any sense. So there is that element. But we should say, in relation to the UK's position, the previous government was making an application to the ICC questioning its jurisdiction over Palestine. But the current government, elected last Thursday, has dropped this challenge. So is this an indication in your mind that Labour may surprise its critics, given that it's dropped one of the aims of the former Sunak government to undermine the ICC. And it seems like this government has signaled, at least now, for now, that it doesn't want to undermine the ICC process.
Well, no credit to Keir Starmer, who of course went public, wearing his mantle of a supposed human rights lawyer, basically claiming that Israel had the right to asphyxiate the Gaza Strip, to prevent the entry of food and water and fuel and electricity. Now, all of a sudden, the new Labour government is, according to press reports, reconsidering Britain's application to the ICC to challenge its jurisdiction over crimes committed in the occupied territories. And I think the credit really should in no way go to either Keir Starmer or the Labour Party or the current British government. I think the real credit belongs to those British voters who re-elected not only four independent candidates, um,
Five.
five. Well, I was going to say four plus Jeremy Corbyn,
Oh,
for
yeah. Okay, of
sake.
course. Sorry there.
Yeah, they elected four independent candidates who defeated Labour candidates on a platform of solidarity with the Palestinian people, and they re-elected Jeremy Corbyn as an independent with a much larger majority than Keir Starmer received in his own constituency, and came several hundred votes short of unseating Starmer's key minion, Wes Streeting, the current Minister of Health. I think this probably put, if not the fear of God, the fear of the electorate into the British government, and probably came to the conclusion, that this was an initiative that could be withdrawn to try to appease its base. I should also add that what we're told about the new UK Attorney General, whose name unfortunately escapes me at the moment, is that he is someone who has apparently on a number of occasions taken quite principled positions on this issue, on also on issues of boycotting Israel and so on. So he may well have been involved in these latest developments as well.
Yes, and the position on the ICC is just one of a number of issues people will be looking to see if there is change in the direction. The other being whether the UK will reinstate funding to UNRWA. The previous government, as we know, cut funds to UNRWA following allegations that there were staff from UNRWA who took part in the 7 October attack, which is completely baseless. And um, and of course, whether it will go through with recognizing a Palestinian state, a number of other issues. And one thing to point out on the election is just how thin Labour's victory is. It's wafer thin. And it's because of the oddity of the British system that you have a situation where someone with only 36% of the vote gets a landslide victory, whereas Corbyn, who had way more votes, 2017, he had 40% plus, and 2019, I think he had 39, but he's seen as a failure. So it's the oddity of the British system that's produced this so-called landslide victory. But it's very, very paper thin, as you mentioned. Um, every Labour candidate will be looking over their shoulder in the next election, because oppositions are mobilizing and Labour knows they've got a huge challenge on their hand. So I just wanted to add those points before moving on to a story from the region. The Arab League last week ceased labeling Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. Why do you think they've done that now?
Well, I think the reason for that is you have an Arab League that has done absolutely nothing in support of the Palestinians since October 7th. Well, for a much longer time, but let's stick to the current phase. An Arab League that is composed of member states that have individually and collectively done absolutely nothing in support of the Palestinians since October 7th, a number of whose members have formal peace agreements with Israel and have maintained those relationships without any impact whatsoever since October 7th, and a number of governments that maintain informal or covert links of various kinds with Israel and have not taken any measures to change those since October 7th. So against this background, to then maintain that Hezbollah, which on October 8th has opened what it refers to as a supportive front or solidarity front, which has been engaged in daily battles with Israel, which perhaps in the space of a single hour has done more in support of the Palestinians than the Arab League and all its member states combined. I think, insisting that Hezbollah is a terrorist organization and that this league and its members somehow legitimately represent the collective Arab will became simply untenable. And it is in that context that I would primarily see this change of position. I have to say, the Arab League has become so irrelevant to the lives of those in the region that I consider myself a follower of news from the Middle East. I wasn't even aware that the Arab League had ever designated Hezbollah a
It was
terrorist.
2014, I think it did. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I would say it's such a hopelessly irrelevant institution. Um, that its lifting of its designation of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization is absolutely meaningless and will have no impact whatsoever in the real world, similar to when it initially designated Hezbollah a terrorist organization, which also was an entirely meaningless gesture that had no impact whatsoever in the real world.
Thank you, Mouin. As always, real pleasure getting your thoughts on these issues. And I hope to see you again next week for another conversation with us to get your thoughts on the weekly bulletins and developments from the region. And thank you. And thank you to all our guests that have joined us, viewers, sorry. And see you next week. Bye-bye.